I would now take your leave and hand over the stage to Mr. Sriram Kari. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and thanks to the organizers for giving me this honor. I've never played cricket in my life, but now I know what the feeling is of those bowlers who get ready to bowl to Sachin Tendulkar.
Wrong ST, but anyway, I'll take it.
Virat Kohli. So, those of us who have followed the works, writings, speeches of Dr. Tharoor for nearly 2 decades, since most of you are engineers and understand technology, today our startup successes when the noun becomes the verb, like Google or Twitter or Facebook. His first mega success in a literary sense was the great Indian novel, where the noun became an adjective, almost, and everybody has wanted to write the great Indian novel ever since. And of course, the book Midnight Millennium or Bookless in Baghdad, the elephant, the tiger, the cell phone, each one has brought in a fantastic sense of idea, found salience across the world. You know, we're reinterpreting India for the world. And then, few months ago, you went and spoke what could have been possibly a 1,000th debate, should have been just another debate, and the internet broke. What was brilliant about this idea of asking the Queen to make up some overdue payments was that on the one hand, it kind of spoke for the subaltern, the poor, the weak, the third world, the oppressed by imperialist forces of the past. But it's also speaking about a new or an older version of nationalism at a subterranean level, perhaps the very narrative India needs today. So I'd like to ask you this. You've spoken about, at the debate for obvious reasons, about the economic reparations that possibly are due to India, the extent of loot, which has never been articulated by anybody so brilliantly since the times of Will Durant's case of India. And then you subsequently modified it, made a moral case saying we're not really looking for money, a pound per year would be good enough. So my setting the scene question for you would be, what does history owe present? What can today demand of yesterday? And can this idea of kind of setting history right be applicable beyond nations? For example, could the Dalit in India ask an apology of the Brahmin? Could the women of the world, and their oppression is not over, demand an apology from men? And your views.
Excellent questions, and great to see you all here. My first visit to any BITS Pilani campus, despite... Despite your fellow campuses in Pilani and in Goa having invited me, I've just not been able to work it out to go there. But Hyderabad won out, so great to see you all. So Mr. Curry's question, I think, is an important one. First, on the question of reparations, I should clarify that the reason I said that, you know, there's no point really trying to prolong the reparations argument is because you cannot truly quantify the enormous amount of damage done to India, Indian society, and the Indian people by 200 years of colonial rule. How do you place a value, for example, on the 35 million lives lost to totally unnecessary famines created and sustained by British policy? How do you quantify the values of the lives of people massacred by the British? And so on and so forth. So ultimately, putting a value on it, putting a number on it and saying you have to pay this much makes, to my mind, no sense. And that's why when the Oxford Union asked me to speak about reparations, I focused on colonial atrocities, and I ducked the question of reparations by asking for a symbolic £1 a year for 200 years, simply because the debate required something to be said on reparations. But I know as a former bureaucrat and former minister that no one would want to administer such a payment for 200 years, so it's not going to happen. What I think the British really ought to do is not reparations so much as atonement. And the atonement I ask for consists of two different things. One is quite simply to teach the truth about colonial history to their schools. They don't do it. The week my book came out, there was an article by a Pakistani journalist in The Guardian who said she had raised 2 children in the best school in London, Westminster. They had done A-levels in history and they hadn't learned a line of colonial history. So I said, this kind of historical amnesia, brushing these realities under the carpet, is, to my mind, wrong, and they need to know. I mean, I have always argued that you can't read Jane Austen without realizing that the lifestyle she describes was being sustained by the sweat of the slaves working on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. Slave money, colonial loot built many of the grand mansions of England, sustained many of the wonderful buildings of London, financed the Industrial Revolution, and the English are blissfully unaware of all of this. In fact, I'll come back to Mr. Curry's larger question in a minute, but just on that subject, I think just teaching is important. The second thing I ask for is an apology, and that's what's leading towards his question, because the apology that I seek is on behalf of the British people and government and the British Crown, in whose name many of these atrocities were committed, to the people of India. Now, obviously, the objection given by many is that there's nobody alive in Britain today and nobody in the British government today who was in any way responsible for the atrocities in India. There's hardly anyone alive in India today who suffered directly from British colonialism, so why bother with an apology? In fact, one British critic rather amusingly wrote, by this standard, why shouldn't we ask the government of Italy to apologize for the Romans feeding the Christians to the lions? But I find that very specious argument, because obviously there is no direct connection between the Roman Empire of those days and the Italian government of today, whereas it's the same British Crown and the same British government in succession to the earlier ones that actually presided over the ruination of India. But more important, because what was done in the name of an entire people. I'll give you 2 examples. Willy Brandt, the German Social Democratic Chancellor, went to Poland and sank to his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto in apology to the Polish people and the Polish Jews in particular for what the Nazis had done to them during World War II. Now, Brandt, as a social democrat, was totally innocent of any taint of the Nazi atrocities. In fact, social democrats like him had been persecuted by the Nazis. So he need not have apologized, but he felt as head of the German government a kind of collective responsibility embodied in his office that he should apologize to the entire Polish nation for what had been done in the name of the German people. The second example is even more recent. What Brandt did was 1970. Last year, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, apologized in the Canadian Parliament to the people of India for the Komagata Maru incident. The Komagata Maru was a Japanese ship laden with Indian refugees fleeing the British Raj, who were turned away from the port of Vancouver. And pretty much everyone on board met a rather grisly end, either on the high seas or at British hands when they came back. And though the Canadians hadn't directly killed anybody themselves, Trudeau felt the same way as Brandt that the people of Canada collectively owed an apology to the people of India. So that's the logic I'm suggesting to the British. Come, for example, seize an episode like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Why do I pick that? I mean, not because of the number of people killed, because if you just look at the numbers, a lakh of Indians were butchered on the streets of Delhi by the British at the end of the so-called mutiny of 1857-58. So in numbers, Jallianwala Bagh doesn't even compare. But what I feel makes it the single most emblematic atrocity of the British Raj was everything that surrounded it. First of all, India supported the British in the First World War at tremendous cost to itself. Because the British promised responsible self-government at the end of the war, by which most Indians understood that we'd get the same sort of dominion status that the white Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa enjoyed, and that means we would have more control over our own affairs. But the British, having milked India for everything, we gave cash, we gave money, medicines, clothing, food, animals, vehicles, even rail lines were ripped out of the Indian soil and shipped off to aid the British war effort. And 1.3 million Indian soldiers fought under arms for Britain. The sum total of the Indian contribution in today's money is estimated at 80 billion pounds sterling. Now, if after all of that, the British had kept their word, it might have been a different story, but the British, of course, broke their word. And perfidious Albion condemned India to further emergency rule by reimposing the wartime era emergency restrictions in something called the Rowlatt Acts. At that point, various protests broke out, particularly in Punjab, and Brigadier General Dyer was sent to Amritsar to impose martial law there, which he did. And he declared what we call today Section 144, that is, not more than 5 people could assemble in one place at one time. And at that time, a bunch of farmers and peasant families from the surrounding villages of Amritsar, almost certainly completely unaware that there had been this prohibition on assembly, gathered in this walled garden at Jallianwala Bagh, family gathering, unarmed, just women and children and parents, to commemorate Baisakhi, the spring festival. Now, Dyer, hearing there was a large group of Indians assembled in a garden, arrived. He didn't ask them what they were doing there, didn't give them a shouted order to disperse, didn't even fire a warning shot in the air. He asked his soldiers to open fire unhesitatingly on the crowd, mowing down men, women, and children and they were moaning and crying as they were rushing to the gates. He had a soldier stationed at the gates so that they would get easier targets to kill. The British admitted to 379 dead in 15 minutes. The Indians claim it was over 1,000. The truth almost lies somewhere in between. But this horrendous tragedy was not the worst of it. Dyer then refused to allow anyone to tend to the dead, the dying, and the wounded for 24 hours, so that their bodies lay rotting in the hot sun, while the relatives waited at the gate so we could hear the piteous cries of the dying, asking for water, which they could not give. Dyer ordered Indians to crawl on their bellies on a street where an English woman had been assaulted, except she'd also been rescued by Indians, but that was irrelevant. And when they so much as lifted their heads while crawling, they were hit on their heads with bamboo staves by the British. At the end of all of this, inevitably there was a public outcry, thank you very much. And the result of the public outcry was the House of Commons condemned Dyer. Promptly the House of Lords exonerated him and praised him. And few British newspapers ran a campaign to raise money to reward Dyer. And he was given by the British, principally the British in India, the princely sum in today's equivalent of £250,000 sterling, together with a bejeweled sword for having killed Indians. And that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, Rudyard Kipling, hailed him as the man who saved India. Saved what in India, whom in India, saved India for whom, not clear. But this is what, for me, that entire package of things, the original betrayal, the actual brutality and killing, the indifference to human suffering of Indians, the self-justification later, the actual reward and praise for this act of wanton cruelty, all of this together, put together, makes the Jallianwala Bagh the single worst atrocity of British rule. So it seems to me that if on the centenary of that event, 13th of April, 2019, a member of the British royal family in whose name all this was done, or ideally the Prime Minister of the British government, I don't really expect that to happen, were to come to Amritsar and apologize there, not just for this atrocity, but for all that it symbolized of what was wrong with the Raj, it would be a tremendous gesture of cleansing. So that answers your question. When you say, what does history owe to the present? It owes an accounting of itself, no more. As far as I'm concerned, I don't want to revenge myself on history. I don't even want to ask for money. I just want moral accounting. I want them to face up to what they've done and say, it was wrong, I'm sorry. And that, I think, is all we can demand of history. Face it in the past. I often say that our problem in India is we are very quick to forgive and forget. By all means, we should forgive. Forgiveness is good. Let's not forget.
I'll do the first opinion poll of sorts. How many of you feel you agree with Dr. Tharoor that the British government, ideally the royal family or the PM, owes India an apology as a symbolic act? If you believe it's his right, raise your hand, please. How many of you believe she should return the Kohinoor back?
What? Get the Kohinoor.
Okay, some of you want that colored stone out of that old lady's hat. You have called Niall Ferguson and several others apologists for the empire who said the railways benefited, may not be the intent of England. English language has benefited. The, in a sense, the three most benevolent contributions of the empire, as some of them argue, free press, the rule of law, the parliamentary institution, a sense of integration of lost India into a modern civilization and a narrative like that. So these are the things that have happened during and because of the British. You do dismiss it saying that I don't need to be colonized to have tea in my backyard, or the cost of the railways was double or even 10 times that built in Canada, etc. But are you, when the apology does come, also willing to say, such as it was not the intent, such as it was barbaric, did the British help or leave India something good at all? Would you be willing to acknowledge it?
It's a fair question, and I will acknowledge it with one very major caveat. And that is that not one of these things was actually intended for the benefit of Indians. When the British brought these things to India, they brought them for their own profit and their own control of this country, and their ability to extract the resources of this country and take it off to England to prosper there. It was not meant for us. The fact that we now have them, and that we have been able to turn them around to serve our purposes, our democracy, our economy, is to our credit, not theirs. Now, the examples that Mr. Curry raised, if you look at railways, the British created the railways to extract Indian resources from the hinterland, which is otherwise inaccessible by animal-drawn transport, and take them to the ports to ship them to England. And also to send troops into the deeper recesses of India to put down potential rebellions. That was the only purpose. They didn't build railways for Indians to travel conveniently from one place to the other. Far from it. Any advantage to Indians was purely incidental, and what is more, they built it charging a ridiculous amount of money to the Indian taxpayer. In fact, they guaranteed such a high rate of interest, it was double the rate of interest available from British government stocks at the time. And between 1850 and 1875 in the London Stock Exchange, there was no single more profitable investment than investing in the Indian railways. You wanted to guaranteed make money, you put the money in the Indian railways, and the Indian taxpayer would have to pay you whatever the railways were spending. And in fact, they spent, as Mr. Curry's already explained, 9 times per mile of railway in India what they would spend to build the same mile of railway in the US or Canada. Only because they didn't need to worry about expenditure control because the Indian taxpayer was paying anyway. We were exploited for every bit of those railways, and the Indian passengers, when finally these third-class carriages were added with their wooden slats for benches, 22 people to a compartment, our Indian passengers paid the highest passenger rates of any railway in the world, higher than the US and so on in those days, while the British companies paid the lowest freight rates of any companies in the world, because the railways were there to serve British interests, as simple as that. So if after 1947, the lines we have built have all served our transportation needs, the conditions for passengers have improved, ticket prices have dropped, so now we're paying amongst the cheapest railway ticket prices in the world. All of that is because Indians have turned this around to serve Indian purposes. Similarly, the English language, I agree that it's a great benefit. We've got this language, we're all able to communicate. I mean, there's no question that in our personal lives, in our social interactions, as well as in our national life and governance, English is a huge asset to us. And in the globalized economy of today, English has helped. But the British never intended Indians as a whole to have English. They wanted English to be taught to a very small, narrow class of interpreters between themselves and the governed. They wanted this buffer community, which Macaulay described famously or notoriously as Indians in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions and morals and in intellect, quote unquote, whose sole job would be to help the British rule the rest of the Indians. At no stage was there any campaign to offer the benefits of English language education to the whole of India, because they were here for the money. And the last thing they wanted to do was to spend more money educating Indians. They made that very clear. At no stage. When they left India, they left us with a literacy rate of 17%. Why? They had no interest in educating the masses. What is more, if Indians then seized upon the English language and turned it around and made it into an instrument of nationalism, where Dadabhai Nauroji could write his first attacks on the British drainage of resources from India. R.C. Dutt, who also translated the Mahabharata into English, could write about the economic exploitation of India. Jawaharlal Nehru could write the discovery of India in English. All of these were not the intended objectives of the British introduction of English. They were the unintended consequences, if you like, that once you introduce a language with it, you open up a world of ideas, of educational possibilities, and indeed, Indians will seize this and turn it around to their advantage. And so they did. But why give the British more credit for it than they deserve? Thank you for English. We'd much rather have learned it from an attractive VSO than from a British Master Sergeant's boot. But that's unfortunately the way we got it.
You place so much of a premium on the power of apology, of atonement. If Congress had, and it's a bit of a counterfactual here, if Congress party had apologized for 84, in 85, 86, 2000, 2001, would Modi have been even possible?
It's an excellent question. I did call. I mean, in 84 and subsequently, I have condemned what happened at the time and thereafter, and those of you who have read some of my earlier writings will know that, because the one good thing about whatever I say is that I have a paper trail of more than 30 years in this country that people can look at to judge for themselves if I'm being honest or consistent or not. And I have consistently, in fact, I spoke to Dr. Manmohan Singh when he became Prime Minister and asked him to do what indeed he subsequently did, to apologize to the Sikh people for these atrocities. There's no question about it. Earlier you asked about the Dalits, and I think that in many ways our constitution itself and the whole affirmative action program is an act of apology to the Dalits for millennia of discrimination and oppression of that community merely by the accident of birth. So apologies in that sense are very, very healthy. But Mr. Modi could also have apologized for 2002, and I have not heard one coming from him yet.
So yeah, if Rahulji falls on his feet like Justin Trudeau, trust me, Modi will be in trouble. But I don't want to put you in trouble here. I'll come back to that in a bit. Could I be the devil's advocate for the empire for one last attempt and say, you say cricket is a game actually should have been invented by an Indian. Cricket was an Indian game accidentally discovered or invented by an Englishman. You dismiss cricket, you dismiss chai, you dismiss English.
No, I love chai and cricket. Look at me, this is it.
But he's the only congressman who still has chai. Anyway, so
no, let me explain. This is an unfair charge. It has to be defended. Chai, I admit in the book as well that we would not have the organized cultivation of tea in India were it not for the English. Because we had tea growing wild in Assam, but we never cultivated it. The truth is that the British were buying tea in China and shipping it expensively to England. And they said, we own a good chunk of Asia by owning India. Why don't we try and grow tea there? So they actually sent a secret agent with the improbably James Bondian name of Robert Fortune to China on 3 successive missions to steal tea leaves. I mean, tea roots and bushes. And 3 times he stole the tea and smuggled it in. 3 times the plant died. So the British were despairing about this, and suddenly an English Scottishman, I think, walking in the hills of Assam, saw something that looked like tea, it turned out to be tea, and they organized cultivation. So there I give the British full marks. But they were not growing tea for us, my dear. They were growing that tea in order to ship it to England and save the money they were spending on buying tea in China. That was why they were growing tea in India. And right up to the beginning of the 20th century, they made no effort to market tea in India. There was a tiny quantity of tea re-imported from England for the British in India to drink. But it was only with the Great Depression, when, as you know, the global Western economy collapsed and the bottom fell out of the market in Britain, that the British tea producers were obliged to develop a market in India where millions of people had to acquire a taste for tea so they could unload their stocks of unsold tea. And that's how, it's as recent as the late 1920s, early 1930s, that tea became a mass consumption drink in India. So once again, I am very happy to have my tea. I thank the British for cultivating it, but I have no illusions. They grew it for themselves, and we merely got it by accident and historical circumstance.
I should have clarified. I wasn't thinking of tea. I was thinking of chai. But what I want to ask you is this. Could the British turn back on you, Dr. Tharoor, and say, listen, Jallianwala Bagh, fine, the famine of Bengal, fine, everything, the kind of resource we forced out of you during the World War I and World War II, fine. Did we not give you, in a sense, Mahatma Gandhi? You acknowledge that he may not have succeeded against the Nazi German kind of a context, and Britishers were fighting them. Leave all the evil that England did they not give you a Gandhi who's still the single thread that holds you together, offers you hope beyond everything? Will you at least say this? Britain gave India Gandhi.
Gandhiji fought against the British. So they didn't give him to us. He got rid of them for us. But something I do concede, and I conceded in the book as well, is that perhaps the noblest thing about the British was the quality of their opponent. Because if Mahatma Gandhi had tried his tactics against Hitler, against Stalin, against Mao, he wouldn't have been around to be celebrated as the father of an independent India. So one of his great insights was that the British were capable of being shamed by their own failure to live up to their own press releases. You know, the British were unbelievably hypocritical. Whenever they talked about wanting to rule India for the benefit of the Indians and so on, privately at the very same time, they were admitting to themselves that they didn't mean it. It's right there in all the documentation. I've quoted it extensively in the book. So when Queen Victoria proclaims that she wants to associate Indians with government after the mutiny, Lord Lytton, 20 years after the mutiny, the Viceroy of India, writes to Queen Victoria saying, of course, we can't really give them any genuine responsibility. That's understood. Or as late as the 1920s, the British Home Secretary, the Home Minister, Sir William Hicks, says openly, you know, we're talking about ruling India for the benefit of the Indians. That's all complete hypocrisy and cant. We know privately amongst us, we seize India by the sword and we are holding it by the yardstick, and we shall continue to do both for our profit. That is the kind of blunt things they said behind closed doors or in notes to each other. And the truth is, that was what the British were all about. But because publicly they claimed to be on this kind of noble mission to bring enlightenment and progressive government to the benighted heathens and so on, Gandhiji had the brilliant insight of being able to shame them. So he would say, I believe your rule over my country is a sin. I believe your law is unjust. But I admit I broke your law. Please punish me. I deserve the strictest punishment you can give me because I broke your law. And the British didn't know what to do. They'd never seen a guy coming and saying, punish me. So they would punish him, but they would feel bad about punishing him, and after a while they'd release him. Gandhiji's other technique, the British had no answer for, which was that he inflicted suffering on himself. He said, I will show you the error of your ways, not by knifing you or throwing bombs at you or hitting you. I will punish myself. and you see if you can live with that punishment. Now, in the case of the British, they couldn't. So when Mahatma Gandhi started fasting and the whole nation's attention was riveted whether he'll live or die from his fast, the British would get into a panic and concede whatever it was that he was asking for in order to get him to end his fast. But again, as I said, if you had tried that with Hitler, Hitler would have cheerfully let him starve to death, and no journalist would have been able to report it. So this much I will grant the British. They were capable of being shamed by their own performance, and the brutalization of India by the British, therefore, was remediable, and as Mr. Curry said, I think we were able to find, through Mahatma Gandhi, a figure who was able to embody techniques of opposition that have since been admired around the world. Gandhiji never won the Nobel Peace Prize, but half a dozen of his followers have been given Nobel Peace Prizes in various countries ever since. So that achievement was there.
So, he's brilliant. This conversation, all the videos, however, cannot be a substitute for your actual experience of reading the book. Trust me, no matter how many talks you've heard about the subject, do find it to pick up this book, actually read. You'll get some unbelievable insights from history. For example, some of you may not know, and the book will tell you that but for a report by the ABP, we may not even have had a Kashmir problem. Just imagine. Or think about it, or go back to have a great reading. I now move to the second section, away from your book, to more contemporary politics, the narratives going in India and the counter-narrative needed, etc. In a sense, and I'm not referring to the petition that came online from Thiruvananthapuram, I asked somebody as I came here, how many Indians who are not cricketers or Bollywood stars could draw you this kind of young audience in India, 40 kilometers away from the city on a Sunday at 11, sitting patiently from about 30 minutes in advance. And I was told, the only person other than you is possibly Narendra Modi. In this book, you digress for a brief while to showcase a kind of preference for the presidential form of democracy and argue that it's better suited to India. At this point of time, it can't be a more disastrous suggestion for Congress, your party. Do you really think a direct de facto, de jure presidential form of election is good for India? Is it the right time against Modi? And if so, in case it is not Rahul Gandhi, do you know of anybody in your party who might better face Modi?
First of all, I'm one of these old-fashioned intellectuals who believes that if an idea is good, it should be advocated irrespective of the specific individuals who may or may not benefit from it. I have been advocating a presidential system in writing for more than 20 years. If some of you have read my book, India from Midnight to the Millennium, which was published exactly 20 years ago, I start my advocacy then. And that was a time when, as you know, we were going through a succession of disastrous coalition governments, one government lasting 13 days, another government falling after 1 year, another government. And I said, for God's sake, this country has so much it needs to get done to develop the nation, to bring prosperity to the people. We can't afford to have this absurd British parliamentary system where you elect a legislature in order to become the executive. The idea of separation of powers is something which is deeply enshrined in my convictions and in most political theory, that the judiciary has an independent role, the legislature has to have an independent role, and the executive has to have an independent role, and the three balance each other. And the only way you can do that is by electing the legislature to legislate and hold the government accountable, and electing the executive to form the government and run the country, and appointing the judges to actually interpret the laws according to the light of the Constitution. This is a classic function, and as far as I'm concerned, the British parliamentary system might have worked in a tiny island nation where even today the largest constituency is about 100,000 voters, 1 lakh. But it simply doesn't work in a country our size because it doesn't work, the concept of it doesn't apply to us. We have a series of multi-party elections. We've had for 25 years, until 2014, inconclusive results with no majority party. We have condemned ourselves unnecessarily to inefficiency when what our country needs is action, results, outcomes. That's why I believe in the presidential system. And frankly, I think that to test an idea by whether one particular individual will benefit from it or not is, to my mind, irrelevant to studying the merit of the idea. In fact, the very first time this theory was floated was when Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister. And of course, everyone opposed it, including today's BJP leaders, saying, no, she'll become a dictator. Well, hello, there's nothing in our system preventing a Prime Minister from exercising authoritative and authoritarian tendencies, as we've seen with Indira Gandhi during the emergency, and as we may yet see with Mr. Modi, who's running a prime ministerial system in a presidential way. So I don't think we should let individuals come in. Now, having said all of that, and I can, if there are questions about the details of why I believe what I believe, I'm happy to address them. But to come back to Mr. Curry's thrust of argument, you talk about what can the Congress party offer as an alternative to Mr. Modi. And let me tell you very bluntly, what we can offer is not, in the present parliamentary system, is not one prime minister versus another particular prime minister. We are offering you a choice of two different styles of leadership and governance. On the one hand, you have the man on the white horse with the drawn sword, the man who has all the answers, who will solve all your problems, who charges in on a stallion and cuts through the knots that are tying this country down. That's the message that is being sold to you on behalf of Mr. Modi. And on the other side, we have a party and a leader who says, you know what, I don't know all the answers. Maybe I don't even know all the questions. But I'll listen to you while you tell me what's on your mind, what's bothering you, what do you want to see us do? And I will work with a team of experienced, able, qualified people who together with me will help you find the answers to your problems. In other words, it's a different style of leadership, a different option of governance that we are offering you.
On March 11th, as the results from Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand came,
Punjab!
one of the things you spoke about the fact is the BJP did not have a single Muslim candidate to fight. It doesn't matter if they are true on their word that no matter who's the MLA, would work for the progress and development and welfare of everybody. And you articulated that there is a need to be represented or for anybody to take the party seriously. So the reason Muslims do not seek or find much confidence, and this is the argument, is because there isn't anybody there. I see this in front of me, the new India, if you like. 99% of them don't have their father or mother assuring them their career for the next 30 years. Each one of them has to compete and struggle and work hard, fail or succeed based on their own efforts. And therefore, they are also seeking somebody who has had a career like that. Do you then, not you as a person, but doesn't your party understand that they would rather more seriously listen to a self-made Shashi Tharoor or anybody else over Rahul Gandhi? And in that sense, is dynasty anti-democracy?
Dynasty is not anti-democracy if it is subject to the democratic will of the voters. I mean, the fact is, our society is characterized by what one might call the transmission of talent through the gene pool, right? I mean, you want to be a good carpenter or a good cobbler, you better have a father or an uncle who's a carpenter or a cobbler because nobody else is going to teach you. That's how the caste system began. Professions came down the family tree. You want to be a Bollywood star, it helps like hell if your father was a Bollywood star, right? You want to be in pretty much any profession. I inaugurated the convention, the All India Convention, the All India Ophthalmologists Association. And the outgoing president told me very proudly that his son had just qualified to be an ophthalmologist, and now he could look forward to his son inheriting his practice. So even in the scientific domain and so on, dynasty is somehow deeply embedded in our culture. It is not like that so much in the West. Of course, we have the Bushes and the Kennedys and so on in America as well, but the truth is that for the most part, the kind of widespread practice that we see in our society of people inheriting the professions, the businesses, the personal activities of their ancestors, that's a particularly Indian thing. Why is it we expect politics to be an exception? Now, it so happens I am an exception. I have had nobody in my family tree who has ever been a politician, and I'm going to have nobody in the rest of my family tree who wants to be a politician. So the question for me is, I've come into this field because I have certain personal convictions. Believe me, I've been put through enough Agni Parikshas by the professional politicians and by others, but I'm there at it because I believe that in a democracy, politics is still the very best way you can make a difference to the future of our society. And that's why I'm there. But for me, personally, dynasty may be relevant, but around me I see some very able and bright people who happen to be dynasts. The credibility they have earned has come from their own hard work. So a Sachin Pilot in Rajasthan, he is there. Undoubtedly, he got his early break because he's Rajesh Pilot's son. But there is no question that he is where he is and he has the popularity he has because of his own daily efforts in leading the party. There's a Jyotiraditya Scindia, who is a compelling orator in Hindi and English, who is a hardworking young man, full of ideas.
I'm hoping you'll name my good friend Arun Yadav instead, but anyway.
No, so we can go on and on and on. I mean, look, let's face it.
You failed to sell those young leaders.
Akhilesh, the Thackeray family in Maharashtra, where is it? I mean, unless you happen to be a spinster lady without a son in the case of either Jayalalitha or Mamata Banerjee, and even they seem to have heirs acquired through, shall we say, non-political means.
Foster son attributed to Mr. Vajpayee.
So the fact is that that is the Indian way, and I don't think you're being fair in somehow considered anti-dynastic or anti-democratic. Let me just say one thing. Dynasty does not work unless there are enough of you to support the dynast. The favorite story I have from another profession is this poor fellow Kumar Gaurav, who had one big hit film with Rajendra Kumar's son.
Love story. Yeah.
Second film flopped, third film flopped, end of the dynasty. No one gave him any major parts again. So the fact is that you will find that dynasty has its limitations because it's subject to the box office in Bollywood. Similarly, in politics, it's subject to the ballot box. If the dynast keeps losing, his charm will disappear. But at the same time, you have to look at the broader thing. In the case of Rahul Gandhi, he's been one of those who's very openly said, I know that I'm in this position because of my birth. I know I have to earn it. And he has been working very hard. He's going through a phase, and the party is going through a phase where we're not doing very well. Though we have done well in some places, which is why I made that comment about Punjab. The truth is that for our successes and our failures, there are lessons to be drawn, and those have to be implemented by the party structure. Thank you. Sorry, the reason I need this repeated doses of hot tea is not only because of my fondness for the British, which you've all seen on display today, but because I have a very bad cough and cold, and I'm just trying to wash it down with hot tea while speaking. So on the dynasty, I just want to stress that, that I think at the moment, it's very clear that if tomorrow there were a free election for the post of Congress president, Rahul Gandhi would win. The Congress workers and the Congress office bearers would almost unanimously still support him. He then has to put that support to the good purpose of winning the broader electorate behind him, and when that happens, we'll talk again.
While he has a cup of tea, at least a few sips, I'll take you back to the memory of a talk he did before the Oxford debate. It's a TED talk, some of you might have seen it. It talks much before others identified the term or the idea, the power of, the soft power that a culture or a nation unleashes, the success of America through Hollywood, through McDonald's and Coca-Cola and so on and so forth. I'd like to link this also to what some good online analysts call the bromance between Mr. Modi and Dr. Tharoor. You guys can't stand each other, you can't live without each other. He tags you as a Swachh Bharat ambassador, then you praise him, then your party fires you as the spokesperson, then you condemn him, then... And then...
But aren't I better off speaking for myself?
And then you support one of his biggest possible disruptive ideas of the future of elections being combined, and we only heard first half, and then I heard why you said it. You said that's because the polarization would be restricted to 4 weeks as well. So there's a lot going on between you and him. No, I mean, Twitter exchange, guys. I mean, you are also the second most popular politician in India in terms of your Twitter, your sense of digital. If you had been asked this suggestion by Rahul Gandhi, would you have taken the Twitter tag Office of RG when the stated motive was to reach out to the minds and hearts of Indians? Just that, look at it, Office of RG, that tells you they're missing the digital. And they get Prashant Kishore and ignore you, and that's all we're talking about.
Well, on the office of RG, I actually spoke to RG at that time and said, you know, isn't it better to just call it yourself? And he said, the truth is, I don't have the time to do many of these tweets myself. I believe many of the politicians, not me, but many others, including he believes Mr. Modi, don't actually write their own tweets. They have their name there, others are writing. He would prefer to be honest about it and say that obviously if it goes from Office of RG, it has his blessing, but that he's not personally writing it, and he felt that would be the more honest thing to the public. Now, others may say that sounds unnecessarily bureaucratic, and I know a lot of parody accounts started, people calling themselves Office of so-and-so and all that. But the fact is, that's all he meant. He meant that, look, folks, these tweets are issued on my behalf, but I'm not physically writing them because I'm running around the country doing other things, and I want my staff to do this for me. And I think you have to respect at least his honesty in admitting that he's not writing those tweets himself.
So, coming to soft power, if tomorrow Mr. Narendra Modi said, would you head an informal or formal delegation on behalf of India, trying to drum up support for India to be a permanent member in the Security Council, would you accept such a possibility?
Yeah. I mean, I have just come back 2 days ago from leading the Indian delegation to Pakistan at the invitation of Sushma Swaraj. You know, I want to say very clearly, when it comes to India in the world, we are all Indians first. Party politics come second. I have long since argued that there is no Congress foreign policy and BJP foreign policy. There is only Indian foreign policy, that our political differences must stop at the water's edge. So from my point of view, it has actually been a very healthy practice that the Foreign Affairs Committee, External Affairs Committee of Parliament has always been chaired by an opposition MP. Vajpayee Sahab chaired it when it was first established. Gujral Sahab chaired it. Today I am the chairman of this committee, and I feel when I'm chairing the committee that I am acting on behalf of the whole Parliament. The majority of my members are BJP members, and not once have any of them had reason to complain that I was being partisan. So when it comes to India's national interest, I am unshakable in my conviction that whoever my government is, whatever, when the country's honor is at stake, the country's position at stake, I will act. So on this Pakistan thing, it was a meeting of the Asian Parliamentary Assembly. They asked me, will I lead the delegation? I didn't even hesitate. I didn't consult anyone in my party. I said yes. And nor has there been any negative feedback. It was the right thing to do.
I'll just do 3 more questions before I open the house to questions. I have the questions from all of you sent through WhatsApp. I'll read out your name, or whoever asked the question. It'll be very kind if you kind of stand up and he could see you, and in a sense, then last 3 questions. I know we'd love to talk to you for at least till evening, but we can't. So the thing I want to ask you is this. Different people have defined the ideal future of India in the 21st century, and some of them have talked about India being a superpower in a very kind of a out of military spend or power in terms of presence in various parts of the world. What kind of a future should India aim for in the 21st century? Do you think in the alpha male sense of the word, India will ever be a superpower? Because all the superpowers, Greeks, the Romans, the Spaniards, British, Chinese, Americans, have had only one language in their country. Do you think we have too many languages ever to be a global superpower, unless by force it becomes Hindi?
Let me say first of all that I'm not sure that that's a worthwhile aspiration anyway. To begin with, before we talk about being a superpower, let's admit we're still super poor. We have a lot to do to overcome the problems faced by the bottom 25% of our society, whether we grow by 9% or 6%, anything, we have to think about that bottom 25%. To my mind, what I first want to accomplish is to ensure that every single Indian has the basics, has a roof over his or her head, has 3 square meals a day, has the possibility of sending their children to a decent school where they actually learn something useful, has the possibility of a job and the prospect of working hard to get a better job. These basic things, and of course beyond that, having a healthcare facility within, let's say, 5 kilometers of their place of residence, having a hospital nearby beyond that, having, if possible, the kinds of conditions that will enable them to fulfill whatever God-given potential they believe they have. That basic, until we can assure that for 100% of Indians, I think it's irresponsible of us to talk in terms of superpowerdom. Secondly, superpowerdom for what? You know, all these illusory ideas, are we trying, a superpower, by the way, by definition is a country that can influence the course of events, the formation of governments on the other side of the world. America could sit in America and change a government in Vietnam.
Russia could do it in America recently.
The Kremlin candidate one, is it? Okay.
I didn't say anything, I just...
Well, the point is that, do we need that aspiration? Is India going to sit around influencing who becomes the president of Guatemala and why? To my mind, these are not necessarily worthwhile aspirations. Rather, if you look at my book, Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century, I have really articulated a vision for India at the center of a different kind of global system. A system of cooperative relationships, rather like the World Wide Web, a networked world where all countries are connected to each other, sometimes in overlapping configurations, sometimes not, sometimes in distinct relationships, others sometimes in multiple relations with several, each of whom in turn is part of other connections, just like your internet today. That is the world of international affairs in the 21st century that I see. And it has no room for any superpower. It only has rooms for connections, for connected powers. When I was minister, I rather rashly tried to suggest that we were moving beyond non-alignment to multi-alignment. Well, the phrase never caught on, so I can't rejoice in it. But my idea was very much, I'll just give you one example. Every year, our foreign minister meets with her Russian and Chinese counterparts in something called RIC. Then she adds the Brazilians and the South Africans, and we get BRICS for annual summit. Then she takes out the Russians and the Chinese, and she meets with the other two in what's called IBSA, for South-South cooperation. Or she adds the Chinese but not the Russians, and they meet as BASIC for environmental negotiations. And in each of these configurations, India is a member, and not merely because its name very conveniently begins with that indispensable element in any acronym, a vowel, but also because we have something to contribute to each of these, and we have something to gain from each of these. Now, this is the kind of system that I see happening. You don't need to be a superpower. If you can have an important role in the world through these multiple configurations, if you can have a say in the global system, in the organization and stewardship of the global commons, if you can be at the high table where it matters. For example, I've joked a few times that, you know, in global geopolitics, you're either at the table or on the menu. And we in India have been rule takers from the rest of the international system for a long time. We have now earned through our growth, our population, our military strength, our economic credibility, the right to be amongst the rule makers. But we've had a curious diffidence in playing that role. I want us to be up there. We don't need to be a superpower, but we can be an extremely influential country in a networked world to determine the course of the planet in the 21st century.
The last question on this theme before I go to careers and what young people can learn from you before going to their very questions. What I want to ask you was this. In a sense, are we still slaves of the empire? So many of the laws that hold us, gender orientation, sexual orientation, you're trying to fight it as a private member, and you don't find support beyond point. In that sense, is the empire still around? Are we still slaves of a past? And what can we all do to break away from that? I mean, IPC's mid-1800s section aimed at controlling an enemy population. That is the power with which a modern SI books an FIR today.
You're so right. And in fact, that again is a section of my book where I have inveighed against the Indian Penal Code imposed on us by Macaulay with his Victorian attitudes and with the colonial desire to suppress, as Mr. Curry says, the subject people. And this is what we have sadly stuck with. I'm dismayed that my own nationalist leaders, who were victims, for example, of the sedition law, under which Gandhiji, Nehru, Annie Besant, so many others were arrested, never took the sedition law off the books themselves when they came to power. They should have abolished it, and I have moved a bill in Parliament to try and get the sedition law amended so it only criminalizes violence or incitement to violence, but not mere speech. The answer to speech is more speech. You're a university, free speech is fine. I tell you, as somebody who is probably older than many of your parents, or at least the age of most of your parents, you have the right to be wrong. This is the age where you should experiment intellectually, where you should hold the ideas you want to hold, and without fear of somebody else jumping on you and saying you're anti-national or you're this or that. I know two good friends in the BJP. I have two close friends in the BJP who are classmates of mine from university, and when I knew them in college, they were Trotskyites and Stalinists, and today they're in the BJP. If I were to reproach them today by their own standards and yardsticks, how they condemn the Kanhaiya Kumars of this world, they would be deeply embarrassed to admit who and what they wrote and said and believed at that time in their student days. But you have to go through a process of intellectual experimentation. In many ways, it is the attempt to sincerely hold a bad idea that teaches you how bad the idea is. So try, if you must.
So, we'll extend it. You were at different campus in the city yesterday. You're in a different campus. The mode is different. What these people have in terms of their agenda for future is different. I know this is perhaps unfair to ask, but this campus is apolitical in the sense that no politics, no elections directly. Isn't this a better college as an example for India than ITSEO? Where there's political parties and there's almost a desire to become the arm of somebody. I mean, a university can't be for one person to find a ticket in some elections.
Okay, so personally,
he was a president of a students' union in Delhi, so.
No, of the St. Stephen's College Union, which was non-political.
Yes,
so we had no political parties.
And Chandan was your senior, and you're not referring, Chandan Mitra was your senior.
He was my campaign manager.
Oh, he's the campaign manager.
And he succeeded me, but he was not elected. It was during the emergency,
Yeah, he was
and he was appointed. So that's another story. But the fact is that, that if you look at the St. Stephen's College experience, there were very, very lively student union societies. There was a tremendous amount of freedom. I'm talking about those days. I don't know what it's like today. Tremendous amount of freedom even to establish new societies. All you had to do was persuade one member of the faculty to agree to serve as faculty advisor. That's all that was required, and the society could be established. It was very free. That's how I was able to resurrect the Woodhouse Society in St. Stephen's College. We played practical jokes and had mimicry competitions and lots of fun. There was everything, hiking society, stamp collecting society, the history society just for debates on history. It was an amazing college, amazingly exciting place intellectually. And our politics, our student politics were lively, but they were non-political in the sense that we never participated in NSUI, ABVP, SFI, AISF, all of that stuff. Do I regret it? No, I don't. But do I want to take it away from those who have it? No, I don't either, because it so happens that much of student politics, probably a majority of student politics in India today, is actually organized politically. And therefore it becomes difficult, especially in larger campuses, to run a non-political election, because you need a a party organization supporting you. Say when there's a Delhi University election, again in my time, St. Stephen's College did not participate in the Delhi University Students' Union, so I didn't have to worry about that, but the Delhi University Students' Union would have 100,000 voters. How do you reach them without a party organization? St. Stephen's College had 1,070 or something. That was the entire student population. That's an accessible target. Even there, I couldn't have sworn I spoke to every single voter. It would not be possible. So I just think that there are some realities one has to bear in mind, and as our population has grown, the need for organized structures in all of this has also grown. But I would say that the youthful spirit of political inquiry that many campuses feature is healthy in its own right because it shows an urgent concern with the problems of the society around you. I will never reproach a student for staying away from student politics, but nor would I reproach a student for participating in student politics if his or her desire is to make a difference to the future of our country. Let me say something that I first wrote way before I came into politics, which is that it is a peculiarity of our society and our democracy that the best and most educated professional classes stay away from politics. If you go to the Western democracies, we are the people who make their politics work. That is, that it's people of our sort of background who are writing the policy platforms, stuffing the envelopes, attending the party rallies, and producing the candidates. Do you know that in the last 6 presidential elections in America, one or the other candidate was from Harvard or Yale? Now think of India, and with the exception of Dr. Manmohan Singh, people of that background aren't in politics. It's as simple as that. People who have studied in a place like BITS Pilani, and as Mr. Curry says, have chosen to stay away from politics, will probably continue to stay away from politics. But then as you settle down in your comfortable engineering jobs or whatever with your single malt at the end of the day, you will curse the politicians who you consider unworthy of representing you. And I ask you, do you not have a responsibility to ensure that this democracy's political leadership is full of people you are proud of rather than people you want to apologize for, or curse, or criticize? My own feeling is a society like ours is a diverse society. All sections of it must find a place in our democratic representation. That's why I chose to become the sacrificial lamb, the first person of a non-political, purely middle-class, professional, educated background to come into politics, electoral politics, not the Rajya Sabha route, and try to make my way the hard way. Now, I want to say to you, it has not been easy. And I was always very amused by the fact that when I was elected in 2009, for the first 3 or 4 months, not a single day went by without somebody coming up to me on a plane, in a public place, on the street, whatever, saying, I'm a banker, I'm a lawyer, I'm an accountant, I'm in private equity, I'm an engineer, and I want to be like you, I want to be in politics. And after all the so-called controversies that started and were manufactured and were thrown at me, and all the Agni Parikshas that were inflicted on me one after the other, how quickly that dried up. And no more were middle-class professionals coming to me and saying, we also want to be in politics. But, you know, there is a price to be paid. I have paid it, and I have so far survived. And I have survived because I have faith in myself, and I believe that what I'm doing is because I genuinely want to see change in this country for the better. I want to be a country that, I want India to be a country that people like you and me can also be proud of every day. And for that, we have to put our feet and our energy and our time where our words are. That's why I'm there. And that's why I say to all of you, no harm in student politics, as long as you're doing it because you care about the future of this country. Politics needs people like you.
In fact, you almost preempted the first question I wanted to bring from the public. This is asked by Sushmita. Sushmita, I'll ask you a question. If it's you, please stand up. For a female who has plans to dedicate her life to the service of the nation, what would be a wiser choice for me? IAS/administrative services or politics? Sushmita?
Okay, wherever Sushmita is, I would say that both are in their own way equally valid. Politics is a profession that involves a fair amount of uncertainty. If you don't have the independent means, if you don't have the ability to support yourself, if the only way you can survive in politics is by forcing yourself to be corrupt so that you can earn a living, then don't choose politics. But if your circumstances are such that you need a secure job and a salary, but you still want to serve the public of this country, it seems to me that something like the IAS would be a terrific way of actually coming in and playing a role. It will take time before you get to a level that you can actually make decisions that affect lives directly, and you'll have to do some drudgery and grunge work at the bottom, but it's definitely worth doing, because at the end I've seen the enormous amount of impact that an honest, hardworking, committed IAS officer can make in our country. So I would urge you to consider that. If you've been fortunate enough to be blessed with some financial security and so on, politics has tremendous possibilities, because, again, ultimately that IAS officer will take orders from a politician. So the politician who is able to get elected and at the same time be true to their principles, such a politician has a different kind of satisfaction. But to my mind, both are equally valid ways of public service.
Pratyush Mahapatra, this is a bit of a counterfactual as well. What do you envision would have been present India if the British had never arrived on Indian shores?
So Pratyush, wherever you are, I have actually explored this briefly in the book. The problem with counterfactuals is they're hypothetical, right? So my guess is as good as yours. But I can explain and justify what my guess is and why it is. If the British had not come and no other colonist had come, because the usual answer is if the British hadn't come, the French or the Portuguese or the Dutch or somebody would have taken over the country because we were so weak and disunited, etc. But if we accept that we would have been able to resist any foreign invader, what was the tendency in the country? The tendency in the country was to try and control the entire subcontinent. The Mauryas did that in the 4th and 3rd century BC. They covered about 80-85% of the entire subcontinent. The Mughals took it up to 90, almost 95% of the subcontinent. Extreme tip of the peninsula they never got to, but otherwise they really had pretty much all of it covered. And the only thing preventing perhaps that last tip was the state of modern communications and or lack thereof, transport and communications in those days. So this ability that the empires had to extend themselves over the territory, by the 19th century, with the invention of modern communications, roads, railways, and later with the internal combustion engine, it seems to me that very clearly somebody would have fulfilled what other monarchs had tried earlier to try and unify the country territorially. The most obvious candidates would have been the Marathas. The Marathas at that point were spreading right across the country. They'd conquered most of the peninsula, including where we are today. They had gone as far as Calcutta, where they were held back by the British dug Maratha ditch. In Delhi, the Mughal emperor was essentially a hostage of the Marathas. They found it convenient to pay him homage as the emperor, but they actually called the shots on what could have been done. If that process had continued, and we hadn't either had the invasion of Ahmed Shah Abdali, 1761, the Third Battle of Panipat, or if they had recovered after his withdrawal and there hadn't been the British victory over the Marathas in 1818, then the Marathas would almost certainly have continued the task. They'd already made a lot of progress. They would have taken over the entire country. They seemed to want to keep the Mughal emperor there as the figurehead, constitutional monarch, whereas beneath them, the civilian power would have been exercised by a bunch of Peshwas and other tough guys. And just as in Japan and Thailand, the two other Asian countries that were never colonized, a system would have evolved that was nationally rooted in the culture and practices of those societies. There would have been all the ritual obeisance paid to the emperor, but a sense of nationhood and constitutional governance, to my mind, would certainly have evolved. As I said, the idea of India is as old as the Rig Veda. It actually does not require the British to come and unify us, as some apologists for the British claim, because the notion is very much there. Bharatvarsh is described as a land between the mountains and the seas. Adi Shankara from my state of Kerala, Shankaracharya, traveled all the way up to Kashmir, all the way to Dwarka in the west and Puri in the east to establish his mutts. There was very much a common civilizational sense of India going back into antiquity. what the Harvard scholar Diana Eck calls a sacred geography of India, knit together by countless tracts of pilgrimage. But it wasn't just a Hindu idea, because Maulana Azad has written about how when an Indian Muslim went on the Hajj, whichever part of the country where he was from, he was immediately considered by the other Muslims, the Arabs in particular, to be from one recognizable geographical unit, namely Hind. So whether you were a Pathan from the northwest or a Tamil from the southeast, you were a Hindi to the Arabs and to the other Muslims. So that sense of civilizational unity, a recognizable geographical space was always there. And in my view, the country would have been knit together by somebody, if I had to bet, probably the Marathas, by the end of the 18th, early 19th centuries, definitely. And that's probably what we would have had. And we would have evolved from there. I mean, Thailand has had a couple of coups, but they've kept their monarch. Japan has had a couple of wars, but they've kept their monarch. Systems have changed underneath. Something like that would have happened in India too, and eventually we would have ended up with a society that we probably would have had a lot more Nawabs and Maharajas and aristocrats strutting about in their jewelry and their finery. Maybe we can do without that, but we would have had that too, because that, you know, a lot of these throughout time, a lot of the parts of India had these chaps parked there by the Mughals who continued. And when the Mughals became weak and the British were rising, these people became essentially monarchs themselves and ended up having to fend for themselves, because if they were being attacked by the British, an SOS to the Mughal monarch wouldn't get them anything. Mughal monarch was too weak. But in the kind of scenario I'm describing, these guys would have remained as kind of provincial heads. And if you look at Malaysia, for example, today they have just like that. They have about 9 different sultans. And these sultans get together every 5 years and elect one of themselves to be the king of Malaysia. We might have even done that. Who knows? Those kinds of possibilities are very much there. But I see every possibility for a united India under some sort of constitutional royal figurehead and a strong civilian government beneath.
There's some excellent questions, but I have very little time, so I just acknowledge the names of people who have sent these beautiful questions. Prerit Agarwal, Kunal Vashni, Kartike Srivastav, Rishabh Thakur, Madhura, Vishnu Kiran, Vishnu Mayank Agarwal, Anirudh Ramesh, Apurva Verma, Snehal Vadwani, Nikhil Navratna, Gokul Kartik, etc. Just the absolute last 2 questions. We have only 4-5 minutes. After this, he'll briefly interact with you, sign your copies, those selfie moments, etc. Considering recent political trends, what do you think will be the future of secularism in India? This has come from Madhura. Would you like to, lady, stand up? There she is.
You know, I've never been terribly fond of the word secularism. I prefer to use the word pluralism. And I believe that is what we are, that is who we are. And that the kind of politics we are seeing, with, for example, the astonishing appointment of Yogi Adityanath as Chief Minister of our largest state, is an aberration that, to my mind, actually is profoundly at variance with the lived reality of India. Let me explain what I mean. Nehruji had this marvelous metaphor of India as a palimpsest. A palimpsest is either a piece of writing or a painting, whatever. Let's say, imagine on a wall, somebody comes and writes something. Then he comes and writes on top of that without erasing what has been written beneath. Then I write on top of what he's written without erasing what he's written. And more people keep writing, and all of this accretion of writings forms a palimpsest. That is what India is. We are a land that has been created by generations and waves of people of all sorts of backgrounds, religions, colors, ethnicities, languages, cuisines, costumes, you name it, all of this, and collectively together we're India. We have grown up. One of the reasons I found it so easy to work at the UN is I've grown up constantly used to being with people who are not like me. I went to school, I had classmates of every conceivable faith, color, caste, costume. It was just normal. That was India. I mean, you go on the streets, you'll find, I grew up in Bombay, you can imagine, there would be a woman in the burqa, there'd be a girl in the miniskirt walking practically side by side. You'd find people coming to school with a cross around their neck, people with a Sardarji's pagdi, people with no other visible identifying mark, but who sported names that gave away their faiths. But we accepted that this diversity was us. This is our society. I remember as a UN official traveling in the Gulf countries in 2004 when the Indian election results came in. And I still remember the face of this official, this Arab official, who reacted with utter astonishment that the election had been won by a woman political leader of Italian descent and Roman Catholic faith, who then made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim president in a country 81% Hindu. And you know, I said to him, boss, this is us, we're just being ourselves. We're not doing this for any effect. We're not doing this to impress the rest of the world. This is simply us being us. And that, to my mind, is what India is all about. You want to call it secularism, I call it pluralism. To my mind, this diversity and this enshrining and celebration and living of diversity is what we're all about. I am a proud Indian nationalist, but my nationalism is the inclusive variety that includes every person in this country, of every caste, every creed, every color, every conviction, every consonant, every costume and custom. Because it seems to me that the great strength of a diverse democracy like ours is that you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you will agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. What worries me is when there is an attempt made to privilege a kind of rhetoric that divides and undermines this diversity, that claims that only one version of Indianness is authentic and genuine and real, that essentially reduces this magnificently diverse land to a land not just of one faith, but of one interpretation of one faith, which happens, by the way, in my view, to be a profoundly wrong-headed interpretation. Because I have, undoubtedly in English translation, I have read extensively the Hindu scriptures, the Puranas, the Upanishads. I have volumes of collections in my home, and I speak with some authority when I say that Hinduism is a religion profoundly made for people who are questioning, who are inquiring, who have room for uncertainty and doubt. You know, the Rig Veda's verse about creation, what does it say? It says, who made this world? Where did it come from? What does it consist of? Only he in the heavens knows, or maybe even he does not know. That's in the Rig Veda. That's the kind of doubt that Hinduism encourages. Now, how do we reduce the soaring majesty of this faith and this civilization to the kind of identity politics of a British football hooligan? My team, you know, bash everybody else on the head for my team. That's not what Indian nationalism should be about. And I believe as long as there are enough of us who believe in the alternative and fight for it and speak for it, then definitely India's pluralism has a great future.
In a minute each, last two questions. What are the three qualities you would recommend every person in this room to have or try to inculcate to have a highly successful global career in the next 20, 30, 40 years in a changing world?
Well, one quality obviously is application, hard work, determination. That goes without saying. Things don't just drop in your lap. You have to work for it. Second, I think, is curiosity, willingness to learn. With it comes openness to things that are unfamiliar. You don't ever grow by being closed. You have to be open. And the mind is like a parachute, you know. Functions best when it's open. Keep your mind open, you'll do well. And the third thing, I believe, when I speak of openness, I obviously include receptivity as well. Huh? So determination, application, hard work on the one hand, receptivity, curiosity, openness on the other. And the third is faith. And I don't just mean religious faith. I mean faith in yourself. Ultimately, each of us, whatever we are, whatever handicaps we may have been saddled with, either of circumstance, of poverty, of physical health, whatever it may be, each of us has the ability to be the best that we are capable of being. No one can be a better you than you yourself, right? So be the best you that you can be, and the rest will follow. Success is yours. Just don't let yourself down.
And the absolute last question, what a pleasure and privilege it's been, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. After the conversation is over, or some of you could come get your copies, and the organizers would give us the details. There's a recent article in Guardian which listed the favorite words of authors. Ray Bradbury, cinnamon, Jane Austen, civility, Agatha Christie, frightful, Charles Dickens, rejoined. What is the most favorite word of Dr. Shashi Tharoor as a writer and as a speaker.
As a?
Speaker, as a debater. One word each.
I suppose in both cases it probably would be argument.
One of my favorite sentences that kind of gives a sense of the entire history of Europe was this. It said, England had Industrial Revolution, Italy has Renaissance, Germany had Reformation, and France had Voltaire. In that sense, I'd request each one of you to stand up for giving the ovation of your life. America has Obama, Canada has Justin Trudeau, India, Dr. Shashi Tharoor.